Yo, welcome once again to our journey through the one and only Fried Pickle Boy's ultimate creepypasta iceberg. And wouldn't you know it, it's right in the middle of October as well, prime time for spooky month material. So, sit back, relax, get yourself a snack or two, and let's read and talk about some scary stories, shall we? It's getting dark now. There's something strange about this jungle. Something malevolent, almost. I can feel it flowing through the air. Why? It's almost starting to get cold in here. We better stop and set up a camp for now. If only to shed some light on the enveloping shadows. Ted the Caver. Let's start this tier with an all-time classic. Ted the Caver is often cited as the very first creepypasta ever written, which is something I'd like to expand upon in a moment. Ted the Caver was originally posted back on March 23rd of 2001 on Angelfire, which if you were online back during that time frame, you'd be quite familiar with the site Angelfire, it being an internet service that offered users the ability to create their own websites. The actual story of Ted the Caver is told through a series of blog posts written by a spelunker named Ted, recounting his experiences exploring the Mystery Cave. The blog posts detail a chain of events that occurred in December of 2000, when Ted and his good buddy Brad, who is often referred to simply as B, went exploring through a cave not too far away from their homes. The two eventually find a small hole that seems like it leads into a larger and unexplored part of the cave, which inspires the duo to start drilling and digging away at the hole to explore it. To explore where no man has ever explored before, or at least so they hope. The two are avid cavers, and so the very thought of exploring a virgin part of the cave was just about as exciting a thing as the two could possibly think of. At some point, the two hear a strange movement and crashing of rocks on the other side of the hole, as well as the sound of flowing water or wind that seems to suddenly go dead silent when the two of them have been in the cave for an extended period of time. At one point, they take their Jack Russell dog, who loves exploring caves with them, to find that he is absolutely terrified of that hole that they are digging into, something which, on one hand, freaks the two of them out, but also only feeds into their hunger to know what exactly is on the other side of this hole even more. And what they ultimately find on the other side of that hole changes their lives forever after. But perhaps it's best I keep that secret for you to find out yourself. But needless to say, the two of them are not exactly alone. Ted the Caver takes careful detail to note the general structure of the cave system, as well as the long process it takes to go exploring caves, and as well as work from inside them. In fact, this tale much like exploring deep inside a tight-fitted cave, slowly and carefully pushes you ever further into the disturbing reality of what they come to find on the other side of that cave hole. In particular, I can say as someone who has a terrible case of claustrophobia, this creepypasta hits me pretty hard. In particular, the description of our titular Ted climbing into the extremely tight hole once they had opened it up just enough for him to get through to the other side, a hole that they named Floyd's Tomb, by the way, is one of the most uncomfortable reads I've come across from a creepypasta. But regardless of that, this creepypasta is an all-time classic for a reason, because it's excellently written. It has the perfect atmosphere, build-up, and payoff. In short, I cannot recommend you read it or listen to it enough. Now, what's interesting about this creepypasta in particular is that at the time when it came out, a lot of people thought that it was actually real, that Ted and B had actually come across something in that cave, and that the story was a true story being recounted for all to read online. Now, I know some of you, having grown up alongside the internet and using it since day one pretty much, might scoff at the idea of people actually believing something like that. But remember that this was really a story ahead of its time, and to top it all off, it actually does have some basis in reality. You see, the story was first discussed on the National Speleological Society message board, which was a forum of the time dedicated to advancing the study, conversation, exploration, and knowledge of caves to those online, back in November of 2004. In the thread, a poster named Ralph Powers noted that he knew B in real life, and had been in the cave described within the story. Later, in January of 2006, a poster named Caverdale noted that the actual cave in the story, which is never named within it, is actually named Interstate Cave, and is located in Utah. It's named as such because the caves went under an interstate. Later, all through 2006 to 2011, Ted's Angel Fire story was shared across the internet in message boards such as Snopes, to Straight Dope, Major Geeks, Bodybuilding, Face Punch, and Unexplained Mysteries, to name a few. However, back in 2005, Ted himself would clear everything up for everyone, debating if the story was real or not, stating that Ted the Caver's page was his original work. He simply elaborated upon a real-life experience with supernatural elements. Ted actually was a caver, so the story was sort of his way of writing about something that he was genuinely passionate about, something that did actually scare him, but also one that he ultimately added to for a better overall story, blending reality with fiction. There would later be an independent film by David Hunt made about the story titled Living Dark, the story of Ted the Caver, which I've never personally seen, but it is definitely on my to watch soon list now. Now, before we move on to the next entry of this tier, I'd like to expand upon something mentioned earlier, Ted the Caver being the first ever creepypasta. This is true to a certain point. It was the first of its kind to be spread around, at least that we know of. But it's also not exactly true either, especially depending on what your terminology of creepypasta actually is. Before creepypastas were creepypastas, that being a copy and paste job of a story that you then share online, I'd argue that urban legends were really the origin point for scary stories of this kind. An urban legend is a sort of folktale that is circulated around under the premise that it's a true story. Back before the age of the internet, these types of stories, like the famous dog licking story, of the hook/killer on Lover's Lane, of the Bloody Mary ritual, etc., were told orally. These types of stories were also known as campfire stories, the sort that you heard from someone else and then go and share with your own friend group, and then some of them go and share it with a different group, and so on and so forth. So you can see the only difference between urban legend and creepypasta is really the method by which the story is relayed. In creepypasta's case, instead of being told orally, it is told through sharing the story on message boards, which then gets shared by others on said message boards to other message boards, etc. It is also technically told orally a little bit because of YouTube videos. Most early creepypastas were told under the premise of them being true. The only real problem with that is also its greatest strength, however. Creepypastas, and by extension all urban legends, can spread far faster through the internet. Thus, the story can get really far. But then, it is a fake story after all. So due to how much exposure it's bound to get, it also means that people can debunk it just as easily and far quicker, using the same tool that you use to spread it from the start. Now, not all creepypastas are meant to fool you into thinking that they are real, mind you. In fact, we sort of live in the meta era of everything at the current moment. So I wager most of you watching this video or reading scary stories of nearly any kind online are going in knowing that it's fake. It's why in this extremely meta, post whatever modern time we live in, storytelling methods such as unfiction and ARGs are so popular, because they allow one's mind to suspend their disbelief for a moment and see what is meant to be taken as real under the premise that it is real in an alternate reality, one that you are currently engaging in. I think the way a story that is meant to fool you into thinking it's real is also the best way of telling these types of stories. And again, since we live in the age of information, when people want to read the information anyway, as a would-be urban legend writer, or internet legend writer I suppose is more fitting at this point, you'll need to up the ante. Provide more evidence, give more detail, maybe insert some more reality into it, and immerse the reader or listener into your version of reality that you've spun for them to sink into. That's what makes a perfect creepypasta / urban legend / ARG, or what the fuck ever you want to call it, in my eyes. And what makes them, as a medium of storytelling, so very interesting. But that's enough of that lesson / tangent for the day. Let's move on to the next entry now, which is White with Red.
So what's going on, my dedicated bros and brodettes? It's me, Luigi Kid, and maybe some of you have already seen my content. I'm a huge creepypasta fan myself, and I've gotta say, I feel very honored being part of this Creepypasta Iceberg video by Edd N Eddy. Yo, if you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe to Dylan's YouTube channel, like this dude really deserves it, and he really needs to get to the 100k subscribers as soon as possible. If you love creepypasta stuff, horror content, iceberg videos in general, yo, this dude got you covered, okay? And also, while we're at it, make sure to smash the like button. You know, a little bit of engagement has never killed nobody. No, thank you so much, Dylan. I would say, without that further ado, let's get straight into the creepypastas. Let's go! White with Red. A man went to a hotel and walked up to the front desk to check in. The woman at the desk gave him his key and told him that on the way to his room, there was a door with no number that was locked and no one was allowed in there. Especially no one should look inside the room under any circumstances. So he followed the instructions of the woman at the front desk, going straight to his room and going to bed. The next night, his curiosity would not leave him alone about the room with no number on the door. He walked down the hall to the door and tried the handle. Sure enough, it was locked. He bent down and looked for the white keyhole. Cold air passed through it, chilling his eye. What he saw was a hotel bedroom, like his, and in the corner was a woman whose skin was completely white. She was leaning her head against the wall, facing away from the door. He stared in confusion for a while. He almost knocked on the door, out of curiosity, but decided not to. This disinclination saved his life. He crept away from the door and walked back to his room. The next day, he returned to the door and looked for the white keyhole. This time, all he saw was redness. He couldn't make anything out besides a distinct red color, unmoving. Perhaps the inhabitants of the room knew he was spying the night before. He had blocked the keyhole with something red. At this point, He decided to consult the woman at the front desk for more information. She sighed and said, "Did you look for the keyhole?" The man told her that he had, and she said, "Well, I might as well tell you the story. A long time ago, a man murdered his wife in that room, and her ghost haunts it. But these people were not ordinary. They were white all over, except for their eyes, which were red."
Obey the Walrus. I covered this creepypasta before on my YouTube Iceberg series, but to be extremely brief, it's this video that's on screen right now, and it's rumored to be a tape made by a cult called La Morza in order to indoctrinate people to join their cult. It's not. It's just a highly edited clip of Sadie Crisp, who unfortunately passed away recently. May she rest in peace. But yeah, there's not a whole lot more to it. It's an old internet creepy video that had rumors connected to it that weren't true. That's it. Mario. So this is one of the most interesting creepypastas of its kind. Mario is a Super Mario World ROM hack by SMW Central user Adam. SMW Central is a hacking resource for Super Mario World, and many ROM hacks would frequently be created and posted on there. A ROM hack is when you alter a ROM or a game file and add new stuff to it. This can be minor or silly little changes to basically creating an entirely new game based on the foundation of said game. The story goes that Mario was a patch made by SMW Central user, well, Mario, whose avatar is an SMW Mario without a face. He was once a semi-frequent user of the website, but usually when he did post, it was something rather mysterious or off-putting to many on the board. At any rate, Adam, a frequent user of the site, posted a thread on the board on December 28th of 2010, which opens as follows. Quote, "Note this is a true story, and sums up what was going through my mind as I was playing this, and I had no idea I was about to be bullshitted the way I was when I played this, and I can say it is by far the creepiest hack that I've played. If you were on IRC, you would have heard me talking about it as well. But anyways, it's late at night, and I don't have a lot of time, and I need to get to sleep. So this is all I have time for," unquote. What follows is a detailed account posted across a few posts of what this innocently named Mario ROM hack posted on the board by the strange user actually contained. Firstly, the ROM hack came with a TXT file, like most would, usually with some instructions and info about the hack. But this one was simply a jungle of text. But something catches Adam off guard. The phrase, "find me," "find me," "find me," seems to be hidden and strewn all throughout the otherwise unintelligible TXT file. From the very beginning, the title screen in this ROM hack is changed from the usual Super Mario World to just simply Mario, which the author notes was rather strange and ominous given the context of the situation. The messages that usually act as tutorial/story are now replaced with these messages that seem to relay a tale of how Mario caused death and destruction upon the land of Dinosaur Island, and that now he's at it again, something which confuses our narrator/playtester. Other text boxes display such threatening messages as "I hate you" or "This is the selfish way out." The lack of music, strangely designed levels, and an overall sense of oblivion adds to the chilling nature of this hack. Later, when Mario defeats the first boss, Iggy, this message is displayed. Quote, "Victim 1. Eyeballs were unable to be found. The victim was found lying on their carpet. Causes of death unknown. Hand marks with unidentifiable fingerprints were found all over the corpse." unquote. This all eventually culminates into a final level where Mario runs through a long hallway with a series of doors too small for him to fit through, before he eventually no-clips out of a wall. Once in this area, there is nowhere to go but down a large pit before the screen cuts to black. And that's it. The hack's over. Adam is left feeling the narrative of the hack was Mario had brought suffering to the land, and that this hack represents Mario's journey to amend his sins by seppukuing himself down a cliff. Once this whole recount of the story was told, many users began to play the ROM hack for themselves, something which you can actually do right now if you wanted to. Eventually, after some discussion on the boards about the hack, with many freaking out, some calling bullshit, and others getting rather interested. Otherwise, with something of this kind never having been posted in this place before, the founder and administrator of the site, Kieran Maynor, would take interest in a particular part of the story. Remember that TXT file? Well, Kieran immediately recognized the TXT file to be none other than a JPEG file, due to its header. Kieran then proceeded to mess around with the file until they managed to uncover an image from it, albeit corrupted. And this was the image that they found. This image sparked a new sense of fear and intrigue in the story, and within a week of the story unfolding, it will be posted officially to the Creepypasta wiki, thus spreading the word of this tale and this image all the more. What's fascinating about the tale, however, is that Adam, to this day, claims that his experience was genuine, and that he had no hand in creating this ROM hack. He simply told his story, being the first one to playtest it for curation on the board. Adam eventually got into contact with a mysterious person who did make the ROM hack to begin with, whom after uploading this hack was never seen again on the boards. According to Adam, they seemed like a normal fellow, despite him claiming, through playing the hack, that it seemed like it was made by a sick individual in the original story. As for the origin of this image, well, as far as I could tell, there are several stories about where its origin comes from, including it possibly being used as a promotional piece for a band to promote their music on 4chan, although this is unverified, all the way to it being used in some Japanese forums before then. It is without a doubt the thing that makes this creepypasta stick out in my mind. I mean, the other aspects are interesting, don't get me wrong, but this image just elevates it to a different level. All the same though, this series of events and the hack itself is without a doubt one of the more interesting internet spooky stories that you can come across, and was really one of the first of its kind as well. I will say that some of the commentary by Adam is a little bit hammy here and there in the actual description of the ROM hack, but besides that, this is one of the first and best video game flavored creepypastas alone, just for the sheer unfolding of these events to a perfect, eerie finale. Bonus entry. Normal for normal people. I added this pasta because I remember at the time that it was quite popular, and is also one of my personal favorites as well. The story starts with our narrator getting a weird chain mail email that stated simply, "Hi there, found this site is very nice, thought you might like. normalfornormalpeople.com. Pass it on for the good of mankind." Because our narrator had nothing better to do, he decides to make sure his antivirus is up and working, and then click the link, only to find a strange and unprofessional looking website with a long and incoherent rant from the center on the page. The site also had an intriguing tagline, "Normal for Normal People," a website dedicated to the eradication of abnormal sexuality, which only fascinates our narrator more. Eventually, he comes to find that every single word of the long rant on that page is a separate link that leads to pages of even more chains of links, and of which some lead to video files. Our protag ends up finding a video titled Peanut.Avi, which he describes as follows. Quote, "It was a 30-minute video of a man and a woman and a dog in a kitchen. The woman would make a peanut butter sandwich, and the man would set it down for the dog to eat. This was all that happened for 30 minutes. It was obvious that the cameraman had to stop filming and wait until the dog was ready to eat again, and the dog seemed rather sick by the end of it." I know what you're thinking. What the hell does this have to do with... I have no clue. I've seen a little over 24 videos from this site, and the majority of them have no sexuality at all, unquote. After having seen this video, our protag goes to share his findings of this video and the strange website on an image board he frequents. However, he finds that there is already a thread on the site about this strange place by a user that received the exact same chainmail as him. The users begin going through as much of the site as they possibly can, searching through miles and miles of links that lead to other links, and from this search came several interesting videos, which I will now read off in full with our narrator's descriptions. Quote, "Licked Clean.Avi, a 10-minute video filmed by a hidden camera in which we see a repairman working on a washing machine for the first 2 minutes. When it's fixed, the repairman talks to the owner briefly and then leaves. The owner checks to make sure the repairman is gone, and he then begins to lick all over the top of the washing machine. This goes on for 7 minutes. Jimbo.avi, a 5-minute video of an obese mime performing his act. It was actually pretty funny, particularly one part where he pretends to pull up a chair and then pretends that it breaks because of his weight. In the last 30 seconds of the video, the camera cuts to static briefly and cuts back to the man sobbing quietly, still wearing mime outfit and makeup. Perhaps it's some kind of obscure fetish? Diana.avi, 4-minute video in which the cameraman talks to a woman in a room different from the interview room. This room looks like one you'd find in a normal person's house. Exactly where they are is never specified, as Diana only talks about her violin playing. She obviously plays her violin, but she keeps getting distracted by something. I didn't notice this until someone on the image board thread pointed out, but if you look at the mirror in the background, you can see a fat man in a chicken mask playing with himself. Jessica.avi, another 4-minute cameraman video. This time he's outside a house, talking to another young woman. They talk about canoe rides. The camera zooms out to reveal the city streets behind them on occasion. The strange thing is, no one so far has been able to identify where this street is. Guesses have ranged from everywhere from Europe to Australia to the Philippines, but there's yet to be a match for the street shown in the video. Tongue-tied.avi, a 10-minute video. The first 5 minutes consists of an elderly woman making out with a mannequin. The video cuts out like it did on the Jimbo.avi halfway through, and the scene is now a group of mannequins huddled together in a circle around the camera. The lights have been dimmed, and the elderly woman is nowhere to be seen. From this point on, there is no sound. Stumps.avi, 5-minute long video where a man with no legs is attempting to breakdance on a DDR mat in what looks like the kitchen from Peanut.avi, but much dirtier. There's a radio playing music unseen in the background, but it stops at the 4-minute mark when the man collapses on the mat in exhaustion. He breathes heavily and pleads with someone off screen to let him rest. This off-screen person becomes terrifyingly enraged and yells at the man to keep dancing, which he then does. You can hear this off-screen person begin to scream as the video ends abruptly. Privacy.avi. The woman from Diana.avi is now playing with themselves on the mattress in the interview room, while the man from Stumps.avi walks around on his hands while wearing some kind of goblin mask. The door in this room was always closed in other videos, but it's now open, In this video, the only light is in the room. The hallway is dark, and near the end of the video, you can see an animal quickly run through the hallway. And then finally, the last video we uncovered, Useless.Avi. In this 18-minute video, a blonde woman from one of the previous interview videos is tied down to a mattress. She attempts to scream, but her mouth is taped over. After 7 minutes, a man in a black suit and mask opens the door, but does not enter. He holds the door open for the animal that was running in the hallway in the previous video. It's revealed to be an adult chimpanzee, its hair shaved, and its entire body painted red. When the chimp enters the room, the masked man closes the door behind it. The chimpanzee sniffs the air for a moment, it may have been blind, and then notices the woman tied to the mattress. It goes into a frenzy and begins to maul her. The assault goes on for a grueling 7 minutes, until the woman finally dies. The chimp eats flesh from her corpse for 4 minutes as the video ends. Our protag then goes on to note how the thread was closed shortly after the discovery of this video, and since then, he has seen these videos, notably Useless.Avi, coming up on other websites since then, but they usually never stay up for long. He tried to find out more about the site and the man behind it, but comes up short, thus leaving us readers with a rabbit hole of a mystery that's depths are seemingly immeasurable. That's normal for normal people. A rather short but effective creepypasta that almost sounds like an ARG or snuff ring type thing depending on how you look at the story. It feels grounded but just creepy enough to have stuck out in my brain all these years later, and ultimately leaves the reader wondering, if they had kept searching through the site, what else might they have found? Sonic.exe 2. So, like before, I must point to my dedicated video on the subject of Sonic.exe, where I cover Sonic.exe and exe2 in detail, as well as the general drama centered around its creator, JC the Hyena, who has been also in quite a bout of controversy lately, by the way. I won't personally be going into that today, but there are plenty of videos out here on YouTube discussing it, so I'd look to those. That being said, Sonic.exe 2 follows a detective and his sister, who is also kind of a detective, I guess, as they try to find out the root cause behind a series of murders / mysterious deaths involving people's computers blowing up and them being mangled and what have you, as well as a single CD of Sonic.exe sitting alongside it. Eventually, they find out that the evil Sonic.exe is actually an eldritch god of sorts called X that is worshipped by a cult called the Cult of X that eventually kill both our detective protagonists, and yeah, that's pretty much it. It's a much longer read than the first one, or at least it feels that way anyway. And I think part of that is because it feels as though it's taking itself far more seriously, but upping the ante in the crazy shit by 11. I suppose it still has that clingy charm that the first one has, and it has grown on me over the years for that very reason. But I have no doubt in my mind that this is actually worse than the first story, especially in the jumps of logic that are here throughout it. It's a bad creepypasta, but an entertaining bad one at the very least. And again, if you want more details about what exactly it entails in its history, then go check out my video on it. Killswitch. So here's one that I actually had never heard of up until I went about making this video. According to the Carvina Files wiki, a wiki dedicated to this game, quote, Killswitch is an urban legend revolving around a supposed 1989 game in which the player had the choice of playing either Ghast or Porto. It was nearly impossible to play as Ghast as he was invisible, which meant that that pretty much everyone chose Porto. A single enemy has been spotted, an undead worker who Porto knew when she was alive, though it is assumed that there's more. Ghast could attack, but Porto could not. It is assumed that Porto's gameplay was akin to a point-and-click puzzle game, while for Ghast, there would be more combat. The game supposedly deleted itself after you finished it and could not be copied. Only 50,000 or so copies of the game were ever created, and so it fell into obscurity. Any supposed buying links are false, as no copies have made it onto the web, save for several encrypted password-protected copies," unquote. From there, an actual story can be unfolded about what this game looked like, deep gameplay and story details, and of course, some gameplay footage, supposedly captured by one of the sons of a game developer at the elusive Carvina Corporation. All of this is fake, of course, a sort of ARG/unfiction story, I suppose. It's a fairly short read and dive, but it's creative all the same. It's not one of the more interesting ones, I will admit. I tried going into the wiki and the YouTube channel and the story, and it's alright. I did kind of feel like there was something I was missing, but I suppose it's just really a urban legend about a game that doesn't really exist, and that's pretty much it. Rugrats Theory. We get to our first theory pasta. A theory pasta / theory creepypasta is basically a genre in of itself, where a dark, crazy, or at times even perfectly logical but unthought of theory is proposed about a series, film, video game, etc. I'm actually a particular fan of these ones, even if most of them are cliche as hell, usually only being one of the following theories. The whole story is happening inside a character's head, maybe while they're in a coma for bonus points. They are all actually dead and or in the afterlife / purgatory, or these characters all represent something evil or whatever. Though the representation thing can be expanded upon to a much greater result, so I usually like those a little bit more. That being said, I still find this to be one of the more interesting offshoots of creepypastas all the same. But at any rate, the Rugrats Theory is about as dark as they come, and goes as follows. Quote, "The Rugrats really were a figment of Angelica's imagination. Chucky died a long time ago along with his mother. That's why Chaz is a nervous wreck all the time. Tommy was a stillborn. That's why Stu is constantly in the basement making toys for the son who never had a chance to live. And the DeVilles had an abortion. Angelica couldn't figure out whether it would be a boy or a girl, thus creating the twins." As for the show All Grown Up, Angelica was a bipolar schizophrenic who as a teenager became addicted to various narcotics, bringing her back to her childhood, thus creating a world in her mind that she obsessed over. Because of the time lapse between the present and the last time she interacted with her imaginary world, she made them older. Angelica was constantly taking hits of acid, so she would never have to live without her creations. To her, her creations were her only company in a judgmental world. Angelica's mom actually died of a heroin overdose. Angelica was schizophrenic and bipolar because she was a crack baby. Additionally, Drew, in his depression, married a gold-digging whore that Angelica idolized because she fooled herself into thinking it was her real mom. However, she always had a concept of her mom, Cynthia. She used a Barbie doll to mirror her birth mother's image, wearing an unwashed orange dress and jacked up hair, which is why she was so attached to it. Later in life, she followed in her mother's footsteps, dying of an overdose at age 13 when All Grown Up was cancelled. The only Rugrat not to be fictional, however, was the unborn Tommy's brother, Dill. However, Angelica didn't know the difference between Dill and her creations. Dill didn't follow her commands, and after endless crying, and a refusal to disappear like the others did when Angelica was angry at them, she hit him. After she hit him, he screamed a screeching tune, and Stu ran in and pulled his niece off of his only child, but it was too late. Dill had a brain hemorrhage, which resulted in a deformation. As he grew up, his damage only became more evident, and by the time he was 9 and all grown up, he lived as an outcast, being ridiculed for his weirdness. The immense guilt over this is what caused Angelica to start using drugs, and to uncreate the Rugrats briefly, until her experience with hallucinogenics. Chaz lost his mind after the death of his first wife, and was in denial that she was ever a prostitute. On a trip to Paris to find love, Chaz fell in love with a hooker named Kira. He was originally going to marry a different hooker, but she just wanted him for his money. Kira once had a daughter named Kimmy, but the baby was torn from her by law due to her cocaine addiction. Angelica imagined Kimmy from Kira's stories. Upon return to America, Chaz and Kira married and got her a green card. It was a surprisingly happy and romantic story. Kira continually struggled with addiction, but was relatively happy with her new life with Chaz. Susie was Angelica's only friend, who entertained the thought of Angelica's creations because they seemed to make her happy. She later became a psychologist and teamed up with Nickelodeon to make the Rugrats. When Angelica died of an overdose, Susie helped arrange her funeral. Because of her addictions and her mental state, Angelica was expelled from society, which led to a break with reality and her eventual death. She spent the last days of her life in the back of the school cafeteria, imagining friends around her and playing with the lives of her creations, unquote. So yeah, pretty messed up, right? Also pretty dumb. Gonna be honest, pretty fucking stupid. I mean, I will admit, from a purely creative standpoint and from a dark comedy standpoint, how this story manages to make every single aspect of that show sound impossibly depressing is impressive, I suppose. But it is of course not very convincing, since it reads more like a, actually, the Rugrats was a pretty fucked up show, guys, and yeah, they're dead actually, and, he married a hooker, and also she was on drugs, and, yeah, bad stuff happened. Also, the part about Susie teaming up with Nickelodeon to make the Rugrats was so stupid. I literally cringe every time I read that part. Like, okay, let's imagine for a second that was actually a real thing. So, you're telling me you made a show, a cartoon show for kids, based around the crazy fantasies of a drugged up 13-year-old. What the fuck is wrong with you? That sounds like the craziest shit I've ever heard. But of course, it's not real and jumps outside the realm of reality. It's not very convincing. But all the same, it is also one of the first of its kind, and certainly got the ball rolling on stories of this nature. And plus, I personally like to read it more as a dark shitpost than a serious theory. But speaking of theories that were making the rounds back at the time, Edd N Eddy theory. So I just had to include this one because I also remember it being pretty popular at the time. It goes as follows. Quote, according to the theory, the children of the cul-de-sac each hail from different eras spanning the early 1900s to the early 2000s. This would explain why the year for the show is so very hard to pinpoint, with multiple anachronisms present, and also why there aren't any adults in the show, although you do catch a glimpse of one every now and then. Rolf arrived first from the 1900s, the theory goes. His family had moved to Peach Creek in order to establish a farm on its land. Rolf died around 1903 when his family's farm animals stampeded and trampled him. This was the supposed reason why he only has one cow, one goat, and a few pigs, and a few chickens. Not enough animals to cause a fatal stampede in the afterlife. Johnny 2x4 came to the cul-de-sac not too long after Rolf's death. Having no friends, Johnny took a marker and drew a face on a piece of wood and dubbed it Plank. He died in 1922 after fighting a long battle with tuberculosis, 6 years before the discovery of penicillin. He took his friend Plank with him to the afterlife, since he was the last thing he saw in life before he died. Purgatory would also explain Plank's occasional sentient behavior, which is most notably demonstrated in the movie. Eddie came next. He was born in New York, but eventually moved to Peach Creek during the Great Depression era. Always trying to make a quick buck, he always sets up scams to get money from the cul-de-sac kids in an effort to escape the poverty he spent his whole life in. Eddie didn't have a proper father figure since his real father abandoned him, and his mother shortly after he was born. With this came the big bro he adored and idolized so very much, despite the latter's abusive nature. After one of his scams went awry, Eddie was chased by the swindled children of the cul-de-sac and ran to the lake and jumped into it. Eddie ended up drowning in that lake, and he soon joined the other deceased children in the afterlife. Even though he was no longer alive, Eddie still tried to chase after the almighty dollar by continuing his swindling nature in the afterlife. Ed and Sarah were the next to arrive in the cul-de-sac. Their father had died fighting in World War II, and as a result, their mother became distant and disconnected. To cope, Sarah developed her bossy attitude, trying to fill the role their parents used to fill before their father died and their mother stopped caring. Conversely, Ed shut the world out and delved into the fantasy world of comic books and monster movies, which exploded in popularity during and after World War II, in order to escape his unhappy life. They both died in a freak car accident in 1953, thus joining the past kids in death. Naz was born in the 1960s era to hippie parents. Described as a flower child, she was a rather flirtatious young girl who would always act that way towards the male children of the neighborhood. In the summer of '79, a serial killer escaped a local asylum, made his way to her house, and then and murdered her along with her entire family. Edd D was born in the 1970s. When preparing to attend college from a young age became the societal norm expectation, and was raised by a very strict, controlling, emotionally distant parents. They pushed him to succeed academically and to be perfectly clean and neat. He is believed to have died as a result of a gas leak causing an explosion with the butane burner from his chemistry set. Kevin was born around the early 1980s. He was born to a broken down house, and he also had an abusive father who was poorly educated, and his mother had passed away when he was a year old. Because of his situation at home, Kevin would act his frustration out on the other children of the cul-de-sac, becoming a bully to cope with his repressed anger. His fascination with his bike fits right in with the birth of the popular X Games in 1995. One night in the winter of '99, his father fatally beat him in a fit of drunken rage, and he died while he was on his way to the hospital. His father was then convicted of his murder and was sentenced to life in prison. When Kevin entered into the afterlife, he reimagined his father as loving, and that he would shower him with gifts. He still kept his bullying ways in the afterlife, however. Jimmy was the last child to enter into the cul-de-sac. He was born in the early 1990s and was diagnosed with leukemia. He never associated with the other cul-de-sac children because his parents believed he was too frail to be around the other kids, and he remained bedridden for the remainder of his life because of this fact. After fighting a difficult battle with his leukemia, Jimmy eventually succumbed to his illness, and soon the cul-de-sac purgatory was complete. The Kankers were different from the other neighborhood children. It is believed that they are actually demons that were sent to the cul-de-sac cul-de-sac to torment the souls of the remaining children who didn't cross over to heaven. The cankers are the only characters with normal colored tongues, which would seem to indicate that they are not dead, and that therefore they must be something different. Surprisingly, the cankers are attached to the Edds for unknown reasons. However, one common guess is that they are the weakest-willed children of the cul-de-sac, or because they each symbolize a certain deadly sin, unquote. That's the theory, and while it's obviously fake, and also definitely does a lot of the Rugrats Theory thing where it's just like grim, dark, awful shit constantly throughout the entire thing, I actually do really love the idea that each kid comes from a different period of time and died of different causes. It makes this one of the more interesting ones to read all the way through at the very least. Mind you, these theories are just for fun. It's taking something innocent or innocuous and turning it on its head. So while I could go into detail as to why both of these theories are wrong, I think you all sort of know that by now. There will be more theory pastas to cover in the future, but for now, let's dive back into a familiar faces catalog. Funnymouth. So this is another story written by the famous Slime Beast. The story follows a protagonist who goes by Lemon Limeskull online, recounting his strange experience when him and his online buddy were simply chatting in a chat room that they had, selling certain illegal things, when a strange user who had the username of Funnymouth made their entrance. Quote, "Hello everyone tonight. I like to lick the blood out of in the person. I see your handsome face. Don't be so sad about it. Come on, smiley face." Unquote. After this, Funnymouth leaves the chat. After some goading from Skull's friend, Ghost George, Skull follows Funnymouth into a separate chat room and recounts his strange interactions with the individual, and notably this staring emote that was used by the user quite a bit. However, Skull eventually tires of the person's one-show act and heads to bed, where he then proceeds to have some of the worst nightmares he's ever had in his life. The next morning, he received an email from Funnymouth, of which he had no way of knowing his email since Skull was an extremely private person online and never gave out his email or other personal information to people. Then he and his friend's website they were using to chat suddenly goes completely down. Well, at least it was for George. For Skull, on the other hand, the site is redirected into a new one, with this awaiting him. A disgusting face made up entirely of blocks of text, of which all repeated the same word: Funnymouth, Funnymouth, Funnymouth. Skull tries to contact Funnymouth again to fix the problem rationally, but it's no dice. Funnymouth instead taunts Skull, saying that he can see him. He can see his handsome face, causing Skull to eventually go into a fit of rage. That same night, he would again have a dream, a nightmare, but this one being in the woods, and at first feeling at peace, before 4 slimy fingers that felt like earthworms slid into his mouth and crushed his lower jaw. When Skull awoke from his nightmare and saw his face in his bathroom mirror, his tongue was hanging out of his mouth like a limp slug, his lower jaw broken around his neck. He starts to laugh. "What a funny mouth he has," he remarks, cackling. The story ends with Skull saying the same bizarre things to George now, implying that he will be the next to have a funny mouth. That's the story of Funnymouth, and I've got to admit, upon rereading it, it's probably one of Slime Beast's lesser works. Like, it's alright, it's not bad, but it doesn't personally grab me as much as his other stories tend to do, which I know can be a bit of a nebulous criticism, but all the same, it's just how I personally feel. Again, it's not a bad pasta, but there is one major flaw, and that being that the narrator is speaking in first person to the reader. And since we know that this is like past events, it begs the question why he's writing like a normal person instead of writing the story as if he were a weird funny mouth monster thing, if that was just an act that they do for people, or what exactly that is. It is left to some mystery, but it feels a little bit like a plot hole for the sake of maintaining the twist at the end, which is especially apparent upon rereading. But all well. Barbie.Avi. Funnily enough, I covered this one back on my YouTube Iceberg video series as well, so I'm mostly going to repeat what I said before. Barbie.Avi is a creepypasta connected to this old video of an amputee woman answering questions for an interview. The creepypasta itself is about a guy who finds a video on an old laptop titled Barbie.Avi that depicts a woman being interviewed who grows increasingly distressed before cutting to a shot of train tracks that are nearby our protagonist's house. He then goes to said train tracks only to find an abandoned house, which after he enters, he then suddenly hears a moan from the inside, and he nopes the fuck out of that place, never to return. The video itself, as I detailed in my YouTube Iceberg series, is nothing actually scary, but it did take a fair bit of time for the internet to find its exact origin, which is simply footage of a woman named Sharon, an amputee who lost her arm in a washing machine incident, giving an interview about it. And it has no real connection to the creepypasta. The creepypasta, on the other hand, I do think is decent. It's not perfect, and I think it could have been expanded upon a lot more. It leaves a lot to the morbid imagination, and while the ending is rather anticlimactic, something about the guy hearing a moan from the house of what might be the kidnappers or their victim, and him running the fuck out of there, it's kind of more believable, I guess. It does give me chills thinking about that exact scenario. Although him never attempting to call the police or anything is also a pretty big plot hole, and also a missed opportunity for the police actually showing up there and there being nothing to be found. Maybe say except one little thing or something. Who knows? I guess what I'm saying is that there are some good bones to this pasta, but the meat is sufficiently undercooked, sadly. The Harbinger Experiment. This is yet another one that I had never read or even heard of up until doing this video. This story in particular is sort of tapping into what you might call a genre in the creepypasta space, that being experiments on people, in a similar fashion to the Russian sleep experiment. The story goes is a man who we only know as Dr. Zimmerman, who is interested in the occult and the metaphysical world, goes about setting up an experiment called the Harbinger Experiment, where 3 subjects would be served up as bait for a possession by something beyond the veil of our world, although this is never clarified as to what exactly that is. This tale is told through the perspective of our narrator, who is one of the team members hired for this secret experiment, alongside a few others. He details how freaky and enigmatic Zimmerman is, as well as his followers' freakish dedication, and the creepy maze-like structure of the underground facility this experiment would be held in. Zimmerman was scoffed at and rejected by the larger scientific community for his focus on the metaphysical and the occult. So he wanted to use this experiment as a means of having people to bear witness to his theories, so that he could prove that they were true. Ultimately, the experiment is actually a success, but to a dangerous degree, as the people who were once offered as bait are now simply husks full of demons, completely being taken over. One in particular has their entire body's shape change and morph into something unnatural, a smooth skin, long-limbed abomination, and of which seems to emit Tiny Tim's Living in the Sunlight song. This all ends with the monster breaking out of its cage after they had kind of fiddled with it and looked at it for a while, and everyone dying. Except for our narrator, of course, who just managed to escape the brutal slaughter, but is now hearing that song near his house yet again, that haunting tune of the demons nearby. And the last few days, it's been getting closer. And so now he writes this story and exposes this government experiment and these secrets before he is killed. That's the basic abridged version of the story. It's a lot longer than I make it sound here, but all the same, it's a pretty decent one, though it does seem to take a lot from other stories / movies as a basis for its own, which isn't really a bad thing, mind you, but I guess this one just doesn't really stick out in my mind as much personally. For example, the Tiny Tim music quirk is cool, but it's also definitely an Insidious thing where the demon of that film had Tiny Tim music playing in the background anytime there was a major scene with it. But hey, it's competently written and it kept my interest, so not too bad. Bonus entry: Home Alone. You're home alone, and you hear on the news about the profile of a murderer who is on the loose. You look out the sliding glass doors to your backyard, and you notice a man standing out in the snow. He fits the profile of the murderer exactly, and he is smiling right at you. You gulp, picking up the phone to your right and dialing 911. You look back out to the glass as you press the phone to your ear. It's then that you notice he is much closer now. You then drop the phone in shock when you notice there are no footprints in the snow. It's his reflection. And now it's time for what I'd like to call the Pokemon Creepypasta Corner. This tier has a ton of Pokemon-related creepypastas, so I thought we might as well marathon them back to back, starting with Pokemon Lost Silver. So this is one of the most famous Pokemon-related creepypastas, though almost all the Pokemon-related ones are pretty popular. Pokemon Lost Silver is a creepypasta story about a disturbing Game Boy Color cartridge for the game Pokemon Silver. The story was first written, where else but 4chan, on a thread created on June 6th of 2010. The story goes that a dedicated Pokemon fan wanted to relive some nostalgia, so he buys a used copy of Pokemon Silver at GameStop while he waited for the new Pokemon game to come out in a week. But once he loaded the game onto his Game Boy, he immediately noticed that the saved game left behind by the cart's previous owner was highly unusual. Whoever had owned the game simply named their trainer Ellipses, had maxed out their Pokedex with all 251 entries, including legendary Pokemons like Celebi and Mew, and had also maxed out their money and levels. Our narrator wonders if this guy either used Game Shark or something of the sort, or was just once a super dedicated Pokemon fan that just sold their cart back as is. However, the oddities don't stop there. In the active party, the past user had only contained a Cyndaquil and 5 unknown, which, while I'm not a huge Pokemon fan, I can tell you they're basically alien-like Pokemon with letter-shaped bodies. The unknown spelled out the word leave, and the Cyndaquil was named Hurry. Our narrator then starts exploring the game where the user left off, that being the Bellsprout Tower, but with no NPCs in it. He then heads into the next room, which is masked in complete darkness. He uses his Pokemon Cyndaquil's ability Flash to illuminate the areas, only for a red, narrow hallway to be revealed. A strange theme plays on the in-game radio, the Unknown's theme, playing in this eerie place. He then ventures down a long hallway, the screen growing darker and darker until he reaches the hallway's end and comes up to a sign. It reads, "Turn back now." Suddenly, he is then asked the question of yes or no, and the narrator, confused, answered yes. The theme changed now to the polka flute radio music, and he was once again in a dark room. And so he used Flash again, only to have the game say Hurry has fainted. He goes and checks his Pokemon, only to find that Cyndaquil was no longer in his active party, and now there were 5 new unknowns, which now spelled out, I died. After this revelation, the narrator then found his character in a small room, only 4 spaces large, surrounded by dozens of dotted graves. He tries his best to get out of this place, but to no avail. He then checked the status of his character, only to find that the Pokemon trainer sprite had changed from its usual confident self to somber looking, and was now missing both of his arms. Then suddenly, our narrator's character is spun downwards. The music stops. He was now completely white and was in another totally red area. He checked his status once more, and now blood leaked from his eyes like tears, and his legs, like his arms, were now missing as well. He then checked his active party again, only to find more unknowns, this time spelling out dying. There was also now randomly a Celebi Pokemon in his party, but missing 1 arm, 1 leg, and 1 eye. Speeding things up a bit, our narrator has his character move forward through the area. There are now some NPCs, but none of them are saying anything when interacted with. He then finds a transparent red NPC, or the trainer/protagonist from the Pokemon Red and Blue games. The two engage in a Pokemon duel between their broken Celebi and a rather sad-looking Pikachu, which ends in both Pokemon killing one another simultaneously. After the fight, the narrator's character was now completely transparent and back inside his room. The profile was now only a head, and the usual unknowns now spelt out no more. He tries to interact with anything in the house, but nothing works. So he ends up walking outside his house, only to be greeted with an endless gray void. He walks south for a very long time into this void, until eventually he finds his character fully colored body before him. And when he tried to talk to it, it simply said, "Goodbye forever," and then vanished. Then suddenly the game says, question mark, use nightmare. And then he was returned to that 4-block trap from before, except this time there was no sprite. When he checked the trainer's status, there was nothing. The trainer's badges were now replaced with skulls. He then checked his Pokemon one last time, only to find the unknown has given him one last message to read. I'm dead. After that, the final text on screen read simply RIP, and the narrator could do nothing more in the game, even if he reset his Game Boy. As the narrator puts it, despite his enormous success as a Pokemon trainer in life, death still came for the gold and silver protagonist in the end, and he was forgotten with the next generation. And that's the story of Lost Silver. If you notice with this one, I had footage to play alongside the events due to it being popular enough to have a full game version for you to play. While it's not super scary to me by any means, I do appreciate that it's not a haunted cartridge or something, or full of hyper-realistic blood or what have you. It's just a hacked Game Boy cart made by someone. For what purpose though, I'm not sure. It's something I always wish these stories touched on a little bit more. The only real comment this story gives about it is that the narrator at one point says they must have been a sick individual, and maybe they just wanted to share this thing as a prank, but either way, it would be kind of interesting to get into the mind of someone who made this thing and then put it into stores, only to be found by one select person. I also like the ending being just a grave that there is no escape from, and it has one of the more clever lines from a video game creepypasta that I've ever personally read. It's how the protagonist has been forgotten by the next generation, which is both a sad and scary reality that many of us living may face from time to time. I mean, and we all will eventually face it in the end, I suppose. The fear and sadness that comes with the idea of being forgotten with generations that come is interesting, and realistic. I mean, after all of us die twice, really. The first time is when we actually die, and the second death is the last time our names are ever uttered. And then, as for Pokemon, with each Pokemon generation comes a new batch of characters and Pokemon, etc. So in a sense, they actually are forgotten, which I thought was a pretty cool and maybe even philosophical idea when applied to real life. It's clever for it being an actual thing in the Pokemon series, but also a legitimate fear in real life, which is pretty cool. Pokemon Easter Egg. Snow on Mount Silver. So this one's clearly inspired off of the last one we read, and Sonic.exe as well, but it definitely has its own flavor. See, the first near half of the story is actually slow. The narrator recounts how she and her brother used to love playing Pokemon, and because their mom loves spoiling them, she would always buy them one edition of the game and the other edition, like Pokemon Red and Blue, Gold and Silver, etc. And if there was ever a third edition, she would give them both one as well. It then goes on to say, quote, "This is going to sound, at first, like a bittersweet story about two siblings who grow up with a couple of games that eventually take them down two different roads. Well, it's a little more than that. The years rolled by, we kept collecting. Game Boys got old, we replaced them. Cartridges finally gave out, we picked up new copies. But we started down two completely different roads before Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald came out. See, around then, my brother got a Game Shark. We had heard all the hacks and cheats you could do with them, even if we were kind of late to the party, and they sounded awfully cool. Our first guinea pig cartridge was my brother's old blue version. We just dicked around with it a little bit, nothing major. But whatever we did, fucked the cartridge up. After just a couple of code entries, it glitched out completely and became unplayable. Naturally, we were upset at first. My brother mourned the loss of his hours of work, and I am sympathetic to him. I told him, it's okay. We can replace it, I guess. Stupid Shark was a waste of money," unquote. This eventually leads the brother to always wanting to hack his games for some reason. Even though it broke his other one, he gets ultra interested in it for some reason. It's described like this, quote, "After seeing the mess it had turned blue version into, I had become opposed to the idea of hacking or cheating any of my games. What can I say? I'm a chick. I feel feelings for the little pixel creatures." Before we go on, can I just note that it was at this exact point that I knew that the writer was in fact not a chick. At least with that Game Shark, but my brother had taken this game's destruction as a personal challenge or something. I don't think he ever played a game after that which wasn't hacked somehow, unquote. Which is a really weird thing to do, I must point out yet again, considering how much it fucked up his stuff the first time, but whatever. This eventually leads to an incident when her brother slices up all of his Pokemon Game Boy carts and smashes his Game Boy to pieces. Quote, "It was awful," I remember him rasping, and the way his voice rattled made my knees weak. "Oh God, whites everywhere, and then black," unquote. His sister is obviously shocked at this random act of destruction, as well as her brother's strange ramblings about something that happened, but when she goes to comfort him, he feels her Game Boy in her pocket and proceeds to grab it out and toss it across the fucking room. She screams, but luckily her Game Boy Advance was just fine. But then he starts running after her to break the Game Boy, with a hammer no less. Now, you might be wondering, where is this all going? Well, I'll tell you where. Straight to the fucking psych ward. Like, literally, they send the brother to the psych ward because something in one of the games he hacked scared him so much he went fucking bonkers. Which, I love this line pertaining to that in particular. Quote, "He ended up in the psych ward of the hospital for 2 days. When we went to visit him, I left my GBA at home," unquote. Now, I know that this line is probably showing that she didn't want to scare him again with the Game Boy, but I like to think that it was because she didn't want him to break it, and that was what was foremost in her mind while her brother was in the psych ward. Something about that is just a lot more funny to me, even if it wasn't the intention. Anyway, he eventually asks his sister if she will go to his room and get get rid of the Game Shark and Pokemon Silver card. It's the only thing left, and that he never wants to play with them again, which is kind of a weird plot hole, because if he really, like, whatever affected him to such a degree came from the Game Shark and the Pokemon Silver cart, wouldn't he break those first rather than all the other ones? Even if he did break all the other ones, wouldn't that one be on his high priority list? Kind of weird, but okay. But I do have to give the pasta kudos thus far for building up this fucking hack to such an insane degree. I mean, it put a kid in the psych ward. What could possibly be so damn scary that it did that? Well, it's supposed to be an Easter egg on Mount Silver where it snows and the snow looks like static on screen, and you traverse a mountain and you fight a bunch of zombie looking Pokemon, and then it seems to leave a virus on your Game Boy, where if you put in other Pokemon games, it's this smiling zombie Pikachu, and it screams at you. The end. Okay. I know I skipped a lot there. Maybe, undersold it slightly. But it's not necessarily a terrible story, but man, after all that buildup, I guess almost nothing could have actually been an interesting payoff. But it basically is just another creepypasta game and not much else. It really makes the brother seem like a little bitch, and the sister too, honestly, because she cries for an entire hour after playing the scary Easter egg hack game or whatever. Like, I can kind of get being upset that all your Game Boy games just got hacked and are, have a virus. Basically, you bricked your Game Boy games. That's upsetting. I could understand them getting upset and crying since, it's so important to them. Breaking all of them and going to a psych ward, though, seems a little intense for that, though, I gotta say. It's a shame, because I sort of like how the story started out. It seems sort of genuine, and the actual storytelling up to that point isn't too bad. But by the time the scary stuff starts happening, it's just way too dramatic. But all well, similar to the other Pokemon and Sonic related creepypastas like this, there is a video game version of the events in it, so I guess at least it was descriptive enough for someone to be inspired to do that, so that's pretty cool. Pokemon Buried Alive model. So this one's pretty short, so I'll read it in full real quick. Often referred to as its code, the Berryman script, the Buried Alive model was to be found on the final story of the Pokemon Tower, in what has now been replaced with the Marowak Ghost. According to the scripts assigned to it, the Buried Alive model was intended to be the boss of the tower. Once reaching the top floor, the following conversation would have taken place with the model. "You're here. I'm trapped, and I'm lonely. So very lonely. Won't you join me?" After this, the battle would be initiated. Once in battle view, the Buried Alive model appeared to be a decaying corpse attempting to crawl out from the ground. It had been programmed to have two white hands, a Gengar and a Muck. Strangely enough, a protocol for the Buried Alive's actions after it was defeated were not written. In the case of the player defeating him, the game would freeze. However, a specific ending was written by an unknown programmer upon losing the battle. In this ending, the Buried Alive model was to have stated, "Finally, fresh meat," followed by several lines of gibberish. He was to have then dragged the player's character into the ground, surrounding him. The scene would finish with the typical game over screen. However, in the background, an image of the Buried Alive character devouring the player was to have been shown. Especially peculiar were the protocols for after this scene. The cartridge was to download this image to the small eternal memory contained in the Game Boy, overriding the title screen that normally accompany the Game Boy turning on. Instead, whenever it was started, the player would view this image as a sound file. Static.mesh was played. The intended purpose for this effect, unlike many of the other factors leading towards Lavender Town Syndrome, is unknown. And that's the story. This one's okay. It's got a cool visual, it's a pretty creepy visual to go along with it. It's a creepy idea, but ultimately it's also kind of nonsensical, like why would Nintendo program this? Why would this ever even be a thing that would happen? It doesn't really add up in that regard. But then again, it does remind me of many urban legends surrounding video games. They usually have something to do with what was originally going to be in the game, but then it was cut out for unknown reasons. But maybe there's some code or some sort of way of having it reappear again, etc. That sort of thing can be cool, and again, the actual idea is pretty creepy. It's just like Lavender Town Syndrome, it's just not very convincing. And finally, our last Pokemon pasta of this marathon is Misfortune.Gb. Now, this isn't actually a Pokemon pasta fully, as you will soon see, but it does connect with it in an interesting way. So, let's have a look.
Misfortune.Gb. Misfortune is an obscure game for the original Game Boy. Since no known hard copies or ROMs exist, all information about the game is derived from personal accounts and a scant assemblage of screenshots. The game does not contain any credits, and whoever created it is still unknown to this day. A few people who have experienced it consider it to be one of the scariest video games ever made. Given its age and cult following among rare horror game enthusiasts, it's entirely possible that authors of widely known creepypastas such as Sonic.exe and Lavender Town Syndrome drew inspiration from Misfortune. Story, concept: the player controls what appears to be a young boy in a strange gothic building. After brief exploring, the player is confronted by a malevolent being. Despite the character never identifying itself, some people, citing notable similarities, claim that it may be a representation of Baphomet, Beelzebub, or even the devil. Upon meeting the mysterious creature, a dialog box will appear with the text, "I exist within the very fabric of reality. Do you want to challenge me?" This is followed by a yes or no choice. Should the player choose yes, the being replies, "Then let's begin." The player is then transported to a series of maze-like rooms, each filled with pit drops, locked doors, keys and traps. The objective for the player is to progress through each room by either reaching the stairs to the next level or solving another kind of puzzle. This can include answering riddles or choosing correct doors or pathways. The most well-known example is in a level where 4 small cabins are shown on screen. A dialog box will appear that reads, "Choose wrong and misfortune will befall your loved ones. Are you ready to play?" Should the player ever make a mistake throughout the game, the screen will cut black before showing a more detailed image of the demon along with the dialog box reading, "I am God here," in what appears to be blood-styled writing. Rumors pertaining to the game's alleged harmful effects began to surface on the internet around the late 1990s. Players claimed to have begun experiencing ongoing depression and dread shortly after losing and seeing the game over screen. Once prominent members of online forums who told such claims are thought to have died or disappeared when they suddenly became inactive without warning. Heated discussions soon dominated these forums for some time, but the mystery never seemed to be getting any closer to being solved. Some wrote the whole thing off as a tasteless practical joke. Others believed that viewing the image of the evil character after losing a game can really cause the player to experience misfortune, as the game's antagonist promised. Soon people began to speculate that the eerie soundtrack of the game was the cause. The music in the game consisted of deep, buzzy tones, off-key melodies. The game had a remarkably unsettling soundtrack, despite composition being limited to the 8-bit Game Boy sound bank. The game overscreen had especially erratic, almost nauseating music with a very high frequency that accompanied it. Rumor has it that this very track could somehow influence moods and thought patterns. Of all the tracks in the game, only the theme that plays when first meeting the demonic entity can be found on the internet today. Searching for playable ROMs or cartridges online is futile because none exist. In fact, most of those who have played it directly hadn't sought out looking for it, but rather stumbled upon it by accident. According to first-hand accounts, certain copies of various Game Boy titles contain Misfortune in its entirety. The means for accessing it through these games vary, but typically involve exploiting glitches or using cheating devices. Although some had detailed what they had done to trigger Misfortune to start. Attempts by others using the same methods had always failed. Another common observation was that many of the sprites in Misfortune had been copied from its host games. Misfortune is known to be integrated in the following: Legend of Zelda, Link's Awakening, Pokemon Red, Spud's Adventure, Pucci Karat, and Atelier Marie. Once again, thank you so much, Dylan, for having me. I really had a lot of fun making this. And if you, my dedicated bros and brodettes watching this, don't forget to subscribe to Dylan the Night Owl, because this dude really, really deserves it. Best of luck in the future, bro.
And that's the story. There's also a secondary piece in which the author recounts his experience knowing a friend who's played the game, who died an awful death shortly after having played the game in what looked like a seppuku incident, but the author being sure it was the game that caused it. I personally really like this one because it has a ton of screenshots and footage that go alongside it, and the game itself causing misfortune as well as being a part of other games is an interesting idea. It's a cool urban legend. Though again, it's not very scary to me, it's just more interesting conceptually. But then again, I think that's more than enough with most of the video game based ones. Which, my goodness, there has been a lot of this tier. Perhaps we ought to take a break from those and look at one a bit different. I mean, we are out in a dark tropical jungle. I don't know a lot of creepypastas that take place here, but I do know a story that takes place in a dark forest. Anansi's Goatman story. So I always heard about this one back in the day, but had never taken the time to read it for myself. Which is a shame, because it's one of the best new ones that I've read from this tier. It's pretty simple. It starts off as a green text story like this. Quote, be 16, be black, and have family down in Alabama. They farm and own a huge amount of land down in Huntsville. Uncle owns a big house and a bunch of trailers they put out in the woods for hunting or camping. Down south, cousins suggest that we go out there to camp. No, I'm a city kid from Chicago, so they tease the fuck out of me, collect food, kill a pig and some chickens, and bring necessities to camp out for a few days. We get to the camp and it's obvious something is weird. We think nothing of it and unpack and go down to the little creek to swim for a few hours. All of a sudden, some older white guy and a white teenager come out of the bushes. He has a shotgun in the crook of his arm and says hello and asks us what we're doing this far back in the woods. Tell him about my uncle, who he knows, and say we're camping out. He tells us we need to be real careful out here and stick together. There was a big animal in the woods. His son, who is my age, asks if he can stay and hang out with us. He says, okay, unquote. The story then turns into normal prose when the author notes it's more difficult to write the story in the green text format. So our narrator, 5 of his cousins, 4 of their friends, and a white kid named Tanner, all ranging from ages 15 to 17, end up camping next to one of the trailers. What then proceeds to happen are various strange events surrounding the intense smell of copper filling the air and then suddenly going away, before a few of them trail off into the woods, only to run back to the rest of the camp immediately after in a cold sweat, piling everyone inside the trailer. Rooster, one of the cousins, explains that they had seen something out there rushing towards them, something Tanner had apparently also seen before a few days back, which they assumed was perhaps a big cat or something. Another cousin, JR, starts going on about how he went to school with a native kid that was telling him about the Goatman, and based on their description, that's what he thinks they saw, but no one takes him seriously though. The story then goes on, quote, nothing else weird happens that night, and we stay another night, and for the main part of the night nothing happens. At about 1 in the morning, we're outside getting drunk and telling ghost stories, as someone is finishing some too spooky story, I don't remember what it's about, the smell comes back. It's so fucking strong that one of the girls literally starts vomiting. I stand up and you can actually feel how clammy the air is. I say we should get inside and this isn't right. We should have just fucking left. We all go back inside and we're standing around. My cousin just keeps going on about how it's the Goatman, it's the Goatman. And my cousin Rooster tries to shut him the fuck up. And all the while I'm just feeling like something is wrong wrong, and I can't figure out what the fuck it is, unquote. Well, that feeling wasn't unwarranted, because shortly after making a batch of 12 hot dogs so everyone can have one of the cousins remarks how it's not fair that our protagonist gets 2 of them, which he then argues with him about for a little bit, and about how everyone got 1. And that's when he and a few others realize something, and immediately have everyone rush out of the trailer. They then count how many people there are, 11. They then start asking how many people were in that trailer, and that's when they realize everyone remembers 12 people being in that trailer the whole time. Panic then ensues as they realize how crazy this situation is. Who was the 12th person? Skipping ahead a bit, several more incidents occur involving the group splitting off to go and get a rifle, and this thing, which they are now calling the Goatman, starts taking the form of others in their group, stalking them, watching them, acting strangely. This all eventually leads to a face-off when they do finally get a rifle and fire into the woods, challenging it. Ungodly screams that sound like multiple animals blaring all at once echo through their now locked trailer until it all eventually goes quiet, and all of them, after a while, start to nod off, hoping that this is all over. But Tanner had been watching the whole time with his rifle in hand, only pretending to be asleep when he saw it happen. Someone walked out of the trailer bathroom and then proceeded to lay down in the middle of the trailer. He watched it get up a few times and laughed quietly before laying back down. He didn't dare alert anyone or dare to shoot at it for fear that it would then instantly go mad and start killing everyone in the trailer all at once. At least for now, though terrifying, it only laid and stood there. Tanner only let them know this detail, what he saw when they all left the trailer that morning, one member of their party trailing behind them, before eventually slipping back into the woods. And that's the story. The way this tale is told really makes it feel like a buddy relaying a real-life scary occurrence him and some lads went through. The use of language and the general tone is realistic and engaging. I absolutely love the story, and it didn't need half of the people dying or meeting bloody ends or for anyone long-term trauma afterward to be effective. Just a very creepy and mysterious occurrence with something no one could quite understand. There are a couple leaps in logic and some unfortunate pitfalls the story falls into on occasion, but overall I would recommend it. It's a pretty good story. Ticci Toby. So we obviously couldn't go a tier without at least one cringy Jeff the Killer ripoff. I mean, come on now. And this is without a doubt one of the most popular ones of its time, and believed by many to be a far superior version of the Jeff the Killer formula. So, is it? Well, let's dive in and find out, shall we? So our story starts off with a rather long description of Toby's mom for some reason, before we then shift focus to Toby, the titular killer teen of this feature. You see, Toby is pretty upset, because he was recently in a car crash with his older sister. He survived, but she unfortunately did not. But also, you see, he's different. Toby has a condition where he is completely numb to pain. Never before has he felt himself get hurt. He could have lost an arm and felt nothing according to this story, which is pretty crazy. But then things get worse for Toby, because it turns out he also has Tourette's syndrome, which caused him to tick and twitch in ways that he couldn't control. So that's pretty bad. But wait, it gets worse, because Toby has Tourette's syndrome. He is also bullied at school. In fact, he was bullied so often and consistently they had to be homeschooled instead. But triple wait, it gets worse. Toby also lives with his somewhat understanding mother and, you guessed it, his drunk, abusive father, who physically, mentally, and emotionally hurts them, and who didn't even go to his own daughter's funeral because he was too drunk that day. So yeah, things are pretty— oh shit son, did you think I was fucking done? On top of everything else, Toby is also now seeing visions of the Slender Man outside his bedroom window, and this has been causing him to hear voices in his head and go into states of complete lack of control and blackouts. Now, I present all of this to you because it's presented in much the same way Clockwork Your Time Is Up did. Fast, furious, and front-loaded to the point that the story is practically screaming at you to feel bad for this tragic backstory fella who you just know is gonna kill his dad later and then become a proxy for Slender Man. Oops, I spoiled the next 25 minutes of the story. But if this exact chain of events is at all a surprise to you, then you haven't been paying attention very much. Ticci Toby is just as formulaic and silly as the other stories of this ilk are. Although I will give some kudos. I sort of like that it's Slender Man turning him into a proxy by feeding into his natural anger for his father. It makes it much more believable when he ends up being a serial killer that can't be stopped, because he feels no pain and is being used by Slender Man as a tool, essentially. Though that does make him a rather apparent Mary Sue, or Gary Stu, I suppose, doesn't it? But hey, at least it's better than they went crazy, and that means that they can now take hundreds of bullets. Anyway, in the same fashion as Jeff the Killer, and many others I've shown here on this iceberg, Ticci Toby ended up being a cute emo boy for all to love and adore, although to be fair, he kind of always was designed to be at least sort of cool emo boy looking. Which, by the way, I'm not like hating on the emo boy look, I'm not saying that, I'm just saying that was clearly the style all these serial killers were going for. Anyway, many also enjoyed pairing him up with the Clockwork character as well, since their stories are so similar, which fuck me if that isn't one of the worst things you could say about a story. But beyond that, I actually remember a fair amount of people liking Ticci Toby, who also didn't like Jeff or Clockwork, which is so weird to me, because having read them all at this point, they are all sort of just variations of the same story. Personally, I'd say I enjoy all of them in a sort of ironic sense. They are very fun reads, they're just not very well written stories. Sort of in the same way that I like a lot of slasher films. There are some very well written and very interesting slasher films, but there's also a ton of just horror movie junk food that is really trashy and stupid, but I love it all the same. So I guess my problem is I've yet to find a really interesting and well written Jeff the Killer type story. They're all just sort of trash. But hey, at the very least, I would not say they're boring, so they got that going for them. And what's interesting is the creator of Ticci Toby, Wade Castaway, has since sort of retaken his character and asked that people stop making fan art of him, that he plans on doing something more with the character, and that it's no longer at all creepypasta related, which I can sympathize with, especially if he isn't proud of the story these days. But hey, I will actually compliment this. The character design for Ticci Toby has always been one of the better parts of the story and character. With that mask, looks like it's always smiling, the goggles, the muted colors, it does look pretty cool. So maybe Wade plans on doing something more interesting with the character in the future. At any rate, I would go into more detail like I did the others, but that really is all there is to the story. Ticci Toby has a tragic backstory, he ends up going crazy through Slender Man prodding him, he kills his dad, and then he ends up becoming a crazy serial killer under Slender Man's control. And that's pretty much all there is to it. Ticci Toby isn't the worst of its kind, it may even be a little bit better than some, but not much in my opinion. Mr. Mix. So I actually remember this one being one of the very few first ones that I listened to during my first dipping into creepypasta years and years ago. God, does that make me feel old to say that. The story starts like this. Quote, does anyone remember an old PC game from the early 1990s called Mr. Mix? It's mainly a typing game, similar to Mario Teaches Typing, where you have to type words in a box to make a chef, the titular Mr. Mix, put ingredients ingredients into a bowl. Unlike most typing games, however, this game is notorious for having an insane difficulty curve. The game has a words per minute requirement for each level, being as low as 10 on level 1 and as high as 85 by the third. By level 5, the requirement reaches over 500, effectively making it impossible to proceed any further." Unquote. The story then goes on to describe how there are low growls that grow progressively louder as each level went on, or how the second and third level have an extremely low quality recording of a hairdryer playing in the backgrounds. The story then goes on to describe how, quote, "most children who played the game reported having vivid nightmares of Mr. Mix speaking to them in a quiet, raspy voice and threatening them to keep quiet about something. However, none of them could remember exactly what it was. One psychologist who saw many of these children reported being disturbed by the sheer amount of terror on their faces as they recounted the details of the nightmare. Many children broke down to tears in the process, begging for their parents to save them. However, no direct relationship to the game itself could be determined by these few cases, as not all children suffered the same adverse effects." Unquote. The game apparently fell into relative obscurity until, as the story describes, a few PC hackers got a hold of a ROM of the game and started digging through it. Using a hacking software, they managed to bypass the game's code on the impossible 5th level, and what they found apparently was extremely disturbing and caused many of them to quit the expedition altogether. Apparently, if the 5th level is bypassed, the game will then crash, and then will write a bunch of files to the user's System32 directory, to the point that one's RAM is almost completely filled. And these files are apparently pictures of people with horribly deformed faces, appearing to scream in pain and agony, with their eyes bleeding, and their outer layers of skin torn clear off in multiple places. If you try to delete any of these files, then the computer will crash and blue screen, causing permanent and irreparable damage to one's user's hard drive. However, eventually some hackers found out that a lone byte apparently made the ROM trigger this, and if you took out the 1 byte, then you could actually see what the final level of the game looked like, which the story then goes on to say, quote, "Unfortunately, all the original hackers declined to discuss what they saw in the final level. All of them became extremely paranoid and reclusive, refusing to talk about anything related to the game, and showing astonishingly extreme symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Most of them ceased to be able to form coherent sentences within a week, and within a month, all of them went missing. All remaining copies of the game were destroyed. To this day, no one knows what was in that game that caused them so much psychological damage. Maybe it's better that way." 2 years after this incident, a man was arrested after trying to kidnap an 8-year-old girl from a grocery store. Through DNA and fingerprint analysis, the man was identified as one of the original hackers who viewed the final level of the game. He was wearing a white chef's hat and had a look of unspeakable malice and insanity on his face. When interrogated, the man would only say one thing: "I'm Mr. Mix." Unquote. So, yeah, it's not the best. In fact, it lines up with a lot of random video game creepypastas, especially the dramatic ending with the hackers all having PTSD over playing the 6th level. Like, anytime one of these pastas does this, I can't help but laugh. Like, imagine you're playing Silent Hill and then you suddenly turn into a serial killer with PTSD because you saw some blood and spooky stuff. It's just so dramatic and dumb. I could understand it messing someone up if there was some dark illegal stuff in the last level or something like that, but it almost implies that they got possessed by the game's character, Mr. Mix, I guess, so it's clearly not that. Still, I do have some major nostalgia for this one. I think that's because it was the first one like this that I had ever come across, and it opened my mind up to what other stories could be told through scary video games like that. And I won't lie, at the time I seriously wondered if the story I was listening to was a little bit real. I know. Maybe I was a little dumb in the moment, but I didn't know what a video game creepypasta really even was at that point. But hey, at least it's an original game. I gotta give it some credit for that, I suppose. And finally, for our last story this tier, we have one of the more highly regarded creepypasta. I'm a search and rescue officer for the US Forest Service. Quote, I'm a search and rescue officer for the US Forest Service, and I have some stories to tell, unquote. That pretty much sums up this not one, not two, but entire collection of creepypastas about a search and rescue officer, or a SAR, relating the many bizarre, creepy, or just sad or slightly off-putting findings he had come across in his time working this job. It's altogether 8 parts and written by Carrie Hammond, and was published on Reddit under the username Search and Rescue Woods, originally being posted to the No Sleep subreddit in August of 2015, with its final update being in December of that year. It really is an assorted collection of creepy stories, all tapping into something more deeply mysterious or eerie. And now when I say 8 parts, each part contains several short to more extended stories. So altogether, you're getting a ton of creepy, sad, or disturbing stories, all having to do with being a search and rescue officer out in the woods. The very first one opens like this. Quote, I have a pretty good track record for finding missing people. Most of the time, they just wander off the path or slip down a small cliff, and they can't find their way back. The majority of them have heard the old stay where you are thing, and they don't wander far. But I've had 2 cases where this didn't happen. Both bothered me a lot, and I used them as motivation to search even harder on the missing persons cases I get called on. The first was a little boy who was out berry picking with his parents. He and his sister were together, and both of them went missing around the same time. Their parents lost sight of them for a few seconds, and in that time, both the kids apparently wandered off. When their parents couldn't find them, they called us, and we came out to search the area. We found the daughter pretty quickly, and when we asked where her brother was, she told us he'd been taken away by the bear man. She said he gave her berries and told her to stay quiet, that he wanted to play with her brother for a while. The last she saw of her brother, he was riding on the shoulders of the bear man and seemed calm. Of course, our first thought was abduction, but we never found a trace of another human being in that area. The little girl was so insistent that he wasn't a normal man, but that he was tall and covered in hair, like a bear, and that he had a weird face. We searched the area for weeks. It was one of the longest calls I've ever been on, but we never found a single trace of that kid. The other was a young woman who was out hiking with her mom and grandpa. According to the mother, her daughter had climbed up a tree to get a better view of the forest, and she never came back down. They waited at the base of the tree for hours, calling her name before they called for help. Again, we searched everywhere, and we never found a trace of her. I have no idea where she could possibly have gone, because neither her or her grandpa saw her come down, unquote. Every post is filled with stories like these, of missing people being found in strange places in the woods, children being abducted, some living to talk of a mysterious person talking to them, others not being so lucky. And then there are the staircases. Quote, on just about every case where we're really far out into the wilderness, I'm talking 30 or 40 miles, at some point we'll find a staircase in the middle of the woods. It's almost like if you took the stairs in your home, cut them out and put them just right there in the forest. I asked about it the first time I saw some, and the other officer just told me not to worry about it, that it was normal. Everyone I asked said the same thing. I wanted to go check them out, but I was told very emphatically that I should never go near any of them. I sort of ignore them now when I run into them, but because it just happens so frequently, unquote. As the parts go on, the tales grow darker. The tales of strangers, of men who can scream like a cougar and reverberate in the air, a body horror, a consistent theme of bad shit happening to kids, eldritch abominations, amongst so much more. All of this is delivered by an officer who is fairly jaded at this due to his overexposure to it. It doesn't get any easier, and it still haunts him, but the engaging, yeah, this is yet another day on the job sadly tones make it an extremely entertaining read. The descriptions of the torment of some of the people he meets or the things he hears or sees is crafted masterfully and never ceases to tease the imagination with some truly terrifying images and ideas. I would go on, but honestly it would take at least 30 minutes to go over it all, and again I think you guys ought to check it out for yourself. In a way, it's almost an iceberg of its own. I mean, I guess it's not that much, but it's still a lot. Enough so that there's bound to be something that unnerves you amongst all these stories. And that is it, ladies and gentlemen, for the third tier of the Creepypasta Island. I hope you're all having a lovely time this spooky month. Let me know down below if you guys have watched any good spooky scary movies or played any good scary games during this month already, or if you plan on it in the near future. I've been rewatching the Friday the 13th films a fair bit, and speaking of scary movies, I think it's now time to reveal what the next video this month is going to be, the mysterious iceberg topic that I've had planned. It's gonna be part 1 of the slasher movie Iceberg by Reddit user Kirino Nakano. Anyone who's been a longtime subscriber of mine or happens to have noticed the clips I use in my Horror Explorer intro could probably guess that I'm a really big fan of horror films and horror video games, slasher films in particular. So I've been waiting for someone to make a really good slasher movie Iceberg for a while. I would have done the disturbing movies Iceberg, but I feel like Wendigoon pretty much covered that one perfectly, and a lot of other people have covered it as well, so I want to do one that's a little bit different, and slasher movies happen to be something that I'm extremely passionate about and know a lot of trivia in history about as well. I don't know how many parts it'll take to get through the slasher movie Iceberg. Probably not as many as it's gonna take for this creepypasta one. I take everything kind of slowly if you haven't noticed, so we'll kind of see how it goes. But all the same, I think it's gonna be a really fun iceberg to start going into. And plus, I already have some cool bonus entries that's gonna make this extra creepy and fucked up and funny, and yeah, it's gonna be a good ride. I also want to take this time to thank you guys because we recently reached 30,000 subscribers. In fact, it happened during the live stream, or premiere rather, of the Backrooms Iceberg. So this channel has been growing so fast lately, and I cannot thank you guys enough for all the nice comments, for supporting my content, for helping me being able to make an income off of making these videos, and just generally being a really fun and cool community. I really couldn't ask for better. Speaking of which, it's also time to thank all of my loyal patrons over on Patreon, including all of my night owlets, my great night owl, the mysterious Medusa's Hex, and both of my arch owls, the courageous carcinogenicist and the good chi vibes and garden party. Thank you guys for the continued support, and of course, if you guys like my videos and would like to support me in a serious way, then be sure to go join my Patreon. You get to watch videos at least one day early, and sometimes even a couple days early depending on how the schedule works out, as well as some other general behind the scenes stuff. But anyway, until next time, this has been Dylan the Night Owl, flying off.